Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a world where love is so powerful that even death cannot erase it, where a soul, bound to another, will cross centuries, lifetimes, just to find its way home. This is not a fairy tale. This is a vow written in blood. This is the story of a king who remembered everything, and the woman who remembered nothing. The screen opens in darkness. Not the peaceful darkness of sleep, but the suffocating darkness of a dying man. We hear a single heartbeat, then another, then silence, and then a voice, a woman's voice, soft as silk, trembling as autumn leaves. If I am to die, and if you are to die, promise me, my lord, promise me we will find each other again. A hand reaches through the darkness. A man's hand, strong, scarred at the knuckles from years of wielding a sword, closes around hers. I will find you, he whispers. In this life, in the next, in every life that follows. I will always find you. Then the scene floods with golden light, and we see it, a palace unlike any in the known world. Towers carved from white jade rising above an eternal sea. Silk banners of crimson and midnight blue rippling in a wind that smells of salt and chrysanthemum. Lanterns floating across dark water like 1,000 fallen stars. This is the Sea Eternal Kingdom, and tonight it will burn. His name was Heijin, the sovereign of the Sea Eternal Kingdom, a man who had unified 3 warring territories by the age of 25. A man who could command armies with a glance and silence a room with a breath. His people called him the Iron Dragon, unyielding, terrifying, magnificent. But tonight, on the eve of the kingdom's greatest festival, Heijin was not a king. Tonight he was simply a man in love. Her name was Lady Seo Yun, the daughter of the kingdom's most revered scholar, raised in libraries rather than throne rooms, more comfortable debating philosophy than attending court banquets. She had wide, serious eyes that noticed everything. The way morning light changed the color of the sea, the way sorrow moved differently across different faces, the way a man who never showed weakness could be undone by a single red chrysanthemum placed on his desk without explanation. She had been placing those flowers on his desk for 3 years before he finally asked her why. Because you look at everything in this palace, she had told him, except what is beautiful. I wanted you to remember that beauty still exists, even in a kingdom built on war. He had stared at her for a long moment. Then he had done something no one in the court had ever seen King Heijin do. He smiled. The night of the festival of the eternal tide, the palace was dressed in its finest. 10,000 lanterns reflected off the sea that surrounded the palace on all 4 sides. Musicians played on floating platforms. Courtiers in robes of emerald and gold moved through the halls like living paintings. Wine flowed, laughter echoed, and King Heijin stood at the edge of the highest balcony, watching Seo Yun dance in the courtyard below with the other noblewomen, and felt, for the first time in his life, that the kingdom he had bled to build was worth something, because she was in it. He called for her just after midnight. She came to his private chamber alone, as she always did, moving through the hidden passage that only the 2 of them knew about. A tunnel carved through the palace walls by a long-dead queen who had also loved in secret. They sat together on the stone floor of his bedchamber, the way they always did, her head resting on his shoulder, his hand drawing slow circles on her wrist. No ceremony, no formality, just 2 people who had somehow, against all odds, found the one person in the world who made the weight of everything feel lighter. Seo Yun, he said. When I am old, truly old, white-haired and useless, I want to be sitting exactly like this. She lifted her head and looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something strange, something that had not been there before. Fear. Heijin, she whispered. I need you to listen to me very carefully, no matter what happens tonight. That was when the doors burst open. His royal bodyguard, Commander Baek Muhyan, strode in without waiting for permission, which was alarming enough. But it was the expression on his face that made Heijin's hand fly to the sword at his hip. Your Majesty, Baek Muhyan said, perfectly controlled. There has been an assassination attempt. The Western Lord. Heijin was on his feet in a heartbeat. Seo Yun, stay here. Bar the door. No. Her voice was strange. Low. Shaking. No, my lord. Please. Just. Please stay. Please, Dawn. He looked at her. Then at Bek Muhayan. Then back at her. I will return in minutes, he promised her. I swear it. He followed his commander into the corridor. The attack, it turned out, was real. 3 assassins in the Eastern Hall. 2 more near the treasury. Heijin cut them down himself, moving through the palace like the Iron Dragon his people called him. Efficient, devastating, unafraid. When the last man fell and the palace bells signaled the all clear, he returned to his chamber. His heart was still loud in his ears. His hands were stained with someone else's blood. He pushed open the door. Seo Yun was standing in the center of the room. She was holding a knife. The blade was long, ceremonial by the look of it, inscribed with symbols he didn't recognize. Her hands were perfectly still. Her face was wet with tears she hadn't wiped away. Hey Jean, she said. Her voice did not shake. I am so sorry. He had time to ask only one question before she moved. Seo Yun, why? The blade found his heart. He felt it as heat first, then as cold, then as a great, spreading silence that started in his chest and moved outward through his limbs like ice through still water. He fell. And the last thing King Heijin ever saw in that life, the last image burned into the dying fire of his consciousness, was her face. Beautiful, devastated, determined, holding the knife, and whispering something he could not hear. He closed his eyes. The eternal kingdom burned, and the soul of a king began its long journey toward rebirth. He was born screaming, as all people are, but unlike most people, he was born remembering. The midwives who delivered him in the east wing of the Joseon royal palace, on a winter morning so cold the Han River had frozen solid, would later say there was something strange about this child. Not frightening, not cursed, but strange. He emerged from the womb already quiet, already looking. His dark eyes moved around the room with an awareness that infants simply did not possess, settling on each face as though cataloging it, checking it against some internal record. They named him Crown Prince Iseohan, son of King Yongjo of Joseon, heir to the dragon throne, the hope of a dynasty. And from the moment he was old enough to lie awake in the dark and wonder why his dreams were full of jade towers and an endless sea, he knew. He remembered everything. 15 years later, by his 15th year, Crown Prince Seohan had become the most unsettling person in the Joseon court. Not because he was cruel, he wasn't. Not because he was arrogant. He was, in fact, unervingly humble for a crown prince, which the court found somehow more disturbing than arrogance would have been. No, he unsettled people because of his eyes. Those eyes had seen a kingdom rise and fall before his first tooth grew in. Those eyes had watched battles and banquets and a woman he loved drive a knife into his chest. Those eyes carried the weight of a life already lived. And when he looked at you, you had the sense that he was comparing you, very quietly, to something he had known before. His tutors called him gifted. The court scholars called him extraordinary. His father, the king, called him ready. Seohan called himself incomplete, because she wasn't here yet. He had been searching for 3 years in the way a crown prince can search, quietly, through information networks, through the census records of noble families, through the careful observation of every young woman brought to court for the standard royal review of potential consorts. Thousands of faces, none of them hers. He had begun to wonder, with a grief that had no name because it was not grief for something lost but grief for something not yet found, whether some vows, even ones sworn across lifetimes, could break. The day she arrived. She came to the Joseon court on a Tuesday in early spring, the kind of day when the plum blossoms were just beginning to open along the palace walls and the air smelled like the exact moment before something changed. Her name was Lady Yoon Haun. She was the eldest daughter of Lord Yoon Dae-suk, one of the kingdom's most powerful civil ministers. She arrived in a palanquin of lacquered black wood, stepped out with perfect composure, and stood in the palace forecourt in a robe of deep green with white plum blossoms embroidered at the hem, and Crown Prince Seohan, who happened to be crossing the courtyard with his attendants at exactly that moment, stopped walking. His attendants kept moving for 3 steps before they realized he wasn't with them anymore. She was looking up at the palace gates with those wide, serious eyes, the same eyes, the exact same shape and depth of gaze, like looking into two dark wells that went all the way down to somewhere ancient, and he felt something in his chest that he could only describe as a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for lifetimes. "Your Highness." His attendant touched his elbow. "Shall we continue?" "Who is she?" he asked. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "That is Lady Yun Haun, Your Highness." "Lord Yun Haun," he repeated. He tasted the name. It was new, but she was not new. She was the oldest thing he had ever known. She turned, then, as though feeling his gaze on her like a hand on her shoulder, and her eyes found him across the courtyard. She looked at him with polite, careful blankness. The blankness of a stranger. She did not know him. She did not remember. The man who walked 3 steps behind Crown Prince Seohan was named Baek Jin-ho. He was 32 years old, tall and spare as a winter tree, with a face that had been carved by discipline into something almost inhuman, all sharp angles and controlled stillness. He had been appointed as the Crown Prince's chief royal bodyguard when Seohan was 8 years old, and in the 7 years since, had proved himself so completely indispensable, so perfectly attuned to the prince's safety, so apparently selfless in his devotion, that no one in the palace questioned his presence at Seohan's shoulder. He was a fixture, a shadow, a comfort even. No one knew that Baek Jin-ho also remembered. He had recognized the Crown Prince the moment he first saw him, the same soul wearing a new face, still carrying that particular quality of contained power. He had engineered his own appointment to the royal guard with the patience of a spider building a web. He had made himself necessary. And when the reports began to filter through court about a Lady Yun Haun, a young noblewoman with wide, serious eyes who had arrived for the spring court review, Baek Jin-ho had gone very still in the way of a man who has been planning for a possibility that he had nonetheless hoped would never arrive. She was back. They were both back. This cannot happen again, he thought. I will not allow it. The Crown Prince's forbidden pursuit. Court protocol was immovable as granite. A Crown Prince did not seek out a lady under review for potential marriage. He did not initiate contact. He reviewed her dossier, observed her at the formal presentation banquet, and made his selection through the proper channels. His Lord Chamberlain conveying preference to the girl's family, negotiations proceeding thereafter. Crown Prince Seohan ignored all of this. Not brazenly, he was too strategically intelligent for brazenness. He arranged coincidences. He happened to be walking in the plum garden at the hour when Lady Haun was given free time to explore the palace grounds. He happened to be reading in the royal library on the same afternoon she was granted access to browse the court archives. He happened to pause near enough to exchange words, while maintaining perfect propriety, never crossing the line that would bring censure down on either of them. She was, he discovered, exactly as he remembered her. Sharp-minded and direct in private, perfectly composed in public. Fascinated by history and philosophy, quietly, devastatingly perceptive. She noticed the way the late afternoon light changed the color of the palace stones. She noticed which courtiers were performing happiness versus feeling it. She noticed when people were in pain and moving through it without showing anyone. She noticed him, too. That was the problem. That was also, in a way that Seohan could not entirely suppress, the joy. "Your Highness," she said one afternoon in the library, not looking up from the scroll she was reading. "You have walked past this shelf 4 times in the past half hour." A long pause. "The collection is extensive," he said. "It is." She turned a page. "So is your patience, apparently. Most people tire of pretending to browse after 2 passes." He stood very still. Then, slowly, he smiled, the same smile that had surprised the entire court of the Sea Eternal Kingdom, once upon a lifetime. "You are very perceptive, Lady Haun." "I am very observant," she corrected, finally looking up. "There is a difference. Perceptive implies I understand what I see. I merely notice it. I am still working on understanding you." He sat down across from her at the reading table. He should not have done that. He did it anyway. "What have you noticed so far?" he asked. She studied him for a moment with those ancient, serious eyes. "That you look at me," she said quietly, "as though you already know how this ends." Something moved through his chest. "Maybe I do," he said. She did not look away. She did not smile. She simply held his gaze for 3 heartbeats, 4, 5, and then returned with perfect composure to her scroll. "That," she said, "is either the most romantic or the most frightening thing anyone has ever said to me. Which do you think it is?" A very long pause. "Ask me again," she said. "When I'm hoping for the engagement revelation." It was Baek Jin-ho who told him. 3 days after the library exchange, on a cold morning when frost still laced the palace eaves, the bodyguard materialized at Seo-han's elbow with the particular quality of silence that meant he was delivering news he had weighed carefully before speaking. "Your Highness, there is something you should know about Lady Yoon Haun." Seo-han kept his gaze on the garden below. "Tell me." "She is engaged. The arrangement was made 6 months ago between Lord Yoon and Minister Choi Hyun-suk. The formal contract has been drawn up. Lord Choi is a powerful man, one of the 3 senior ministers. The engagement cannot be broken without significant political consequence." Silence. In the garden below, a single plum blossom detached from a branch and drifted, very slowly, to the snow-dusted ground. "I see," Seo-han said. "Your Highness, it would be advisable to transfer your interest to one of the other ladies under review." Another silence. Longer this time. "Tell me, Jin-ho," the crown prince said, very quietly. "If a man spent his entire life waiting for something he had been promised, and it arrived, finally, exactly as he had hoped, would you advise him to simply look away? A beat. If looking at it caused him harm, Your Highness," Baek Jin-ho said, "then yes, I would." Seo-han finally turned. He looked at his bodyguard for a long, measuring moment. "You are very loyal, Jin-ho," he said. "Always, Your Highness," said Baek Jin-ho. And he smiled, and it looked completely genuine, and it was not. The campaign against Lady Haun. It began as whispers, the kind that move through court like smoke. Impossible to trace back to a source, impossible to confront directly. Suggestions that Lady Haun's family's loyalty to the throne was not entirely sound. A rumor that her maternal grandmother had once been connected to a treasonous faction. Questions, careful, deniable questions, raised in administrative meetings about whether it was appropriate for the crown prince to spend time in the company of a woman whose political reliability was uncertain. Seo-han, watching the whispers spread, felt something cold settle in his stomach. Someone was protecting a pattern. Someone did not want this reunion to succeed. He increased his own investigations quietly, using his personal intelligence network. A gift, ironically, from his past life, where he had learned that a king without information was simply a man in expensive clothing. He set people to tracing the rumors backward through court, to finding whose voice had spoken first. The investigation took 12 days. The answer, when it came, arrived in a sealed letter delivered by a palace maid who disappeared before anyone could question her. The first whisper had originated from Commander Baek Jin-ho's household. Seo-han sat with that information for a long time. He sat with it, and he thought of a corridor in a jade palace by an eternal sea, and a man who had appeared at precisely the wrong moment to warn him of danger. And he thought, "I have been here before." What Seo-han remembered, the truth he carried. There was something he had never told anyone, something he had carried alone since childhood. He remembered Baek Mu-hyun, Baek Jin-ho's soul in a previous body, from the Sea Eternal Kingdom, remembered him as a loyal commander, trusted, essential, and he remembered the thing he had been too wounded, in the moment of his death, to fully register. Baek Mu-hyun had known where the assassins would be. He had led Hae-jin directly to them, efficiently with perfect timing, as though the route had been pre-planned. As though someone had arranged the attacks to position the king in exactly those corridors, at exactly those moments, drawing him away from his bedchamber, drawing him away from Seo-yun. The knife, the betrayal, the blood. He had spent lifetimes believing he understood that scene. But what if he had been reading it wrong? What if the woman he loved hadn't betrayed him? What if she had been trying to do something else entirely? Something he hadn't understood because he had died before she could explain? "I am so sorry," she had said, and her hands had been perfectly still. And her face, a woman celebrating a murder does not weep like that. He had to know the truth. The royal monk's warning. The royal monk of the Joseon palace was an ancient man named Hyangak, who had served 4 kings and claimed, serenely, that he had served many more than that in ways that did not involve the current dynasty. The court thought he was poetically eccentric. Seohan had always suspected he was something more. He sought the monk out in the mountain temple above the palace, where Hyangak spent his mornings in meditation so deep that 3 attendants had once failed to wake him for an emergency court summons. "I was wondering when you would come," the monk said, without opening his eyes. "You knew I would?" "I knew the circumstances would eventually require it." "Sit down, young king." Seohan sat. "What happened in my past life?" he asked. No preamble, no pretense. The monk was quiet for a long time. "The royal bloodline of the Sea Eternal Kingdom," Hyangak said finally, "carried a curse. Ancient. Older than the kingdom itself. Every king of that line was fated to have his soul devoured at death. Not released, not reborn, but consumed by the curse, trapped forever in a void between lives. Eternal death. No rebirth. No second chance." Seohan's breath stopped. "The only way to break the curse," the monk continued, "was for the curse-bearer to die by the hand of the person their soul was most bound to. Someone whose love was so complete that the sacrifice would shatter the curse." A very long silence. "She knew," Seohan said. It was barely a sound. She had discovered the curse 3 months before the festival. She had spent those months consulting every scholar, every monk, every text she could find without alerting the court. She tried to find another way. There was none. "She killed me to save me. She broke the bloodline plus. Baek Muhyan," Seohan said. "He was in love with her, had been for years. When he realized she would sacrifice everything to save you, he decided that if he could not have her, he would ensure she spent the rest of her life destroyed by what she had done. He hoped she would shatter. She did not, but she carried that grief until she died." Crown Prince Seohan sat in the mountain temple above the Joseon palace, and felt the last piece of a wound he had been carrying across lifetimes finally, terribly, close. She had not betrayed him. She had saved him, and someone had made sure he never knew. The pregnancy, and the monk's most shocking revelation. He found out about the pregnancy not from Lady Haun, but from her maidservant, who came to the crown prince's household in the middle of the night in a state of barely controlled terror. The maid, a young woman named Bakhtiak who had served Haun since childhood, had found her mistress collapsed in her room, white-faced and trembling, having just discovered something she was not yet prepared for. Seohan reached Haun's quarters within the hour. She was sitting upright on her sleeping mat, very still, with the expression of someone who has received information so large that their body hasn't caught up with it yet. "Haun," he said quietly. She looked up at him, and for the first time since he had known her in this life, her composure was completely gone. She looked young and afraid, and he recognized the expression with a gut punch of recognition, exactly as she had looked on the night she killed him. "Your Highness," she said. "I don't know how to." He crossed the room and sat beside her and took her hands. The formal protocol that prohibited this, the rules, the ceremony, the 1,000 reasons a crown prince should not be in the private quarters of an engaged noblewoman at midnight, fell away like paper in water. "Tell me," he said gently. "I am with child," she whispered. "I discovered it tonight. Idon's father is—" She stopped. She swallowed. "Minister Choi and I have never—" She closed her eyes. "There was no union. The engagement was political. I have not— We are not yet married. I have not been with him. I have only been with—" She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. He understood. He understood the impossible mathematics of it. He also understood, with the certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime carrying memories across death, that impossible things happened precisely when they were most needed. He returned to the monk the next morning. "The child," he said without sitting down. "Who is she?" Hyangak looked at him for a long moment. "You already know," the monk said, and Seohan did know. He had known the moment he held Haun's hands in the dark and felt, for the first time in this life or the last, a third presence, faint as a candle flame in a storm, but there. "The child we lost," he said. "In the sea eternal kingdom. Our daughter. Rebirth," the monk said simply, "does not always travel alone." The news moved through the palace like fire through dry wood. It was Baek Jin-ho who started it. One carefully placed word to Minister Choi's household. One suggestion, framed as concern, that Lady Haun's virtue might have been compromised during her time at court. That the crown prince's unusual interest in her warranted scrutiny. That perhaps the spring court review had exposed the palace to a scandal that required immediate containment. Minister Choi Hyun-suk was a man whose political power had been built over 40 years through calculated marriages, strategic alliances, and an absolute intolerance for anything that threatened his dignity. He was not, at his core, a cruel man, but he was a proud one, and wounded pride in a man with enough power looks very much like cruelty. He called an emergency session of the Senior Ministers' Council. His argument was elegant in its brutality. Lady Haun, contracted as his future wife, had compromised herself under the royal roof. This was a matter of court law. By the conventions of the Joseon court, a betrothed woman found to have violated her contract was subject to public disgrace, the punishment of her family, and in extreme cases involving scandal touching the royal household, could be subjected to exile or worse. The child, if there was one, was illegitimate and could be seized by the court. He presented this not as revenge. He presented it as law. And the most frightening thing about it was that he was right. The crown prince in the storm. Seo Han received the summons to appear before the king and senior ministers on a Tuesday morning. Standing in his private garden where the plum blossoms were now in full bloom, he read the summons. He set it down on the stone bench beside him. He stood very still for a very long time. Then he began to plan. He had lived through a kingdom falling. He had watched fire consume jade towers. He had been betrayed. No, he corrected himself. He had believed he was betrayed, which was worse in some ways because the wound had been self-inflicted. He had come back from all of that. He was not going to lose this again. He went first to his father. King Yongjo of Joseon was a man who had built his reign on careful compromise and political wisdom, and he looked at his son across the throne room with the expression of a man who had been hoping this particular crisis would resolve itself before arriving at his door. "Seo Han," the king said tiredly, "do you understand what you are asking me to allow? I am asking you to protect an innocent woman and a child who has done nothing wrong. You are asking me to overturn a legal betrothal contract, offend one of my 3 most powerful ministers, and sanction a relationship that began without proper procedure. Politically, I understand the politics, father." Seo Han's voice was quiet but immovable as stone. "I have always understood the politics. I am asking you which matters more." A long, weighted silence. "This woman," the king said carefully, "means that much to you?" "She has meant that much to me," Seo Han said. "For longer than you can imagine." Haun discovers the truth. It was Baktiak, her faithful maid, who finally told her. Not everything. Baktiak didn't know everything. But she knew what she had overheard in the palace corridors. That Commander Baek Jin-ho had been the source of the whispers against her. That he had triggered Minister Choi's retaliation deliberately. That the crown prince's bodyguard, the man everyone trusted absolutely, had been working against them from the beginning. Haun sat with this information for an afternoon. And then she did something that Seo Han, who had been trying to protect her from all of this, had not anticipated. She went to Baek Jin-ho herself. She found him in the palace's eastern hall, alone at dusk, and stood in front of him with the kind of directness that had once made a crown prince sit across from her in a library against all protocol. "Why?" she asked simply. Something shifted in the bodyguard's face. Barely perceptible. A crack in the mask. "You wouldn't plus. Try me." Baek Jin-ho looked at her for a long time, and in his eyes she saw something that made her stomach turn. Not malice, not the clean simplicity of evil, but something far more complicated. Longing, grief, a love that had curdled into obsession over so many years that the man carrying it could no longer tell the two things apart. "I have known you," he said quietly, "for longer than you know, and I watched you choose him, again and again in every life. I watched you sacrifice everything for him, and he never even understood what you were giving up. Haun went very still. What did you just say? You done, plus plus, plus plus. She stood in the fading light of the eastern hall and felt something enormous shifting in her chest. Not memory, not the clean, intact recall that Seohan carried, but something more diffuse. A sense of recognition like a song heard from very far away. I, plus plus. She left him standing there. The confrontation, all truth revealed. It was Seohan who finally brought everything into the open. He convened a private audience, just himself, Baek Jin-ho, and 2 senior court scholars he trusted absolutely. He laid out everything. The evidence of the rumor's origin, the timing of each strategic interference, and then, watching his bodyguard's face with the attention of someone who had been trained by one life's death to read what people hid, he presented the final piece. You remember the Sea Eternal Kingdom, the Crown Prince said. Silence. Then, how long have you known I remember? From the beginning, Seohan said. I just needed to understand why you were here. Whether you... Baek Jin-ho looked at him for a long moment. The mask came down completely, and what was underneath it was just a man. Exhausted, grief-worn, caught. I loved her, he said simply. And she never loved me. I know. You done. No, Seohan agreed quietly. I probably done. A very long silence. What will you do? Jin-ho asked. What I should have done in the other life, Seohan said. Tell her the truth. All of it. The night he told her everything. He chose the plum garden. It was late evening, the blossoms silver in the moonlight, and they sat on the stone bench at the garden's center with the propriety of their stations entirely abandoned. Her hands in his, both of them very still, while he told her everything. The Sea Eternal Kingdom. The festival of the eternal tide. The knife. The death. The rebirth. The long searching years of this life. The monk's revelation. What she had done to save him. What it had cost her. The daughter who was coming back to them. He told her all of it. She listened without interrupting. Without moving. Her face was very still and her eyes were very full. And when he finished speaking, the garden was so quiet, he could hear the individual petals of the plum blossoms moving against the night air. Idon plus. I know. But when you said those things to me in the library, when you looked at me like you already knew the end. She stopped. I thought I was imagining it. The feeling that I was not seeing you for the first time. That I was seeing you again. You were, he said. She looked down at their joined hands. I killed you, she whispered. You saved me, he said. There is a difference. A single tear dropped from her face to the back of his hand. He didn't move to wipe it away. All this time, she said. It name, a kind of grief I could never met. I used to think I was simply a melancholy person by nature. You were grieving for me, he said. Across the boundary of lives. She looked up at him. And something in her eyes, not memory, exactly, but the warm space that memory leaves behind, cracked completely open. I think, she said slowly, I have been waiting for you to explain that to me for a very long time. The king's decision. King Yongzhou of Joseon was not a romantic man. He was a pragmatic man, a politically sophisticated man, a man who had spent 40 years making difficult choices and living with their consequences. He had built his reign on careful balance and was not naturally inclined toward grand gestures. But he was also a father who had watched his son, who had always been, from his very first infant days, somehow older than anyone around him, sit across a throne room and say, with the absolute certainty of someone who had staked something vast on a single truth, she has meant that much to me for longer than you can imagine. He convened a private tribunal. He dissolved Lady Haun's betrothal contract to Minister Choi on grounds of improper procedure in the original arrangement, a technicality his senior scholar had discovered, genuinely, in the contract's legal language, which the king chose to believe was providence rather than convenient timing. He accepted his son's formal petition to have Lady Yoon Haun considered for crown princess, pending the traditional review process. And he called Minister Choi to a private audience where he explained, with the gentleness of a man delivering difficult news and the firmness of a man who had made a decision, that political capital was a renewable resource and dignity was not. and that he was offering the minister an overseas diplomatic posting of considerable prestige as an alternative to public confrontation. Minister Choi, who was fundamentally a man of calculation rather than passion, accepted after only a brief moment of consideration. The crisis, that had felt for weeks like a mountain about to fall, stepped to one side. Baek Jin-ho, the end of a long road. Seo-han went to Jin-ho one last time. He found him in his private quarters, already packing. Jin-ho looked up when the crown prince entered, and neither of them spoke for a moment. I1 plus. I plus is not mine to give. He set something on the table between them. A sealed letter. A posting to the southern coast. Not a punishment posting, a genuine one. A commander plus T hate you, Jin-ho. But you can. Baek Jin-ho looked at the letter. He looked at the man in front of him who had been his king across lives, who had died at his indirect hands, and was still, inexplicably, intolerably, extending him a path forward. Why? Jin-ho asked. Because you also remember, Seo-han said. And I know what that is to carry alone. A very long silence. Jin-ho picked up the letter. I hope, he said quietly, that she makes you worthy of it. So do I, Seo-han said. On the first day of summer, in the 43rd year of King Yongjo's reign, Crown Princess Yoon Ha-eun was formally invested in a ceremony that the court historians would later describe as unusually moving, not because of its grandeur, which was considerable, but because of the way the crown prince looked at his bride. Not with the careful, composed admiration appropriate to a royal ceremony. With the look of someone who has been crossing a very long distance and has finally arrived. In the months that followed, the court adjusted itself to Ha-eun as it eventually adjusted itself to everything, with varying degrees of grace and complaint, but ultimately with acceptance. She was, it turned out, extremely good at court politics, despite having been raised primarily on philosophy texts. She had a particular talent for noticing which alliances were genuine and which were performative, and she applied this talent with the quiet precision of someone who had been trained, across a lifetime of library afternoons, to tell the difference between what was written and what was true. She learned to be a princess. Seo-han watched her become magnificent. And through all of it, the question that had haunted him across decades and lifetimes, did she betray me? Was simply gone, replaced by the only question that had ever really mattered. Are you here? Yes. Then we are all right. The child. Their daughter was born in late autumn, when the maple trees along the palace walls had turned the red of old lanterns and the air was sweet and cold. She came into the world quietly, unlike her father, who had arrived screaming and already looking. She arrived with her eyes closed and her small fists pressed to her cheeks, and she breathed in the autumn air of the Joseon palace with the deep, satisfied breath of someone who has been traveling for a long time and recognizes the place they've arrived. The royal monk Hyangak visited 3 days after the birth. He looked at the child for a long time without speaking. Well, he said finally, she made it. Ha-eun, exhausted and radiant, looked at him. You knew she would come. I had a feeling, the monk said. Souls like hers dawn. Seo-han sat beside the bed and looked at his daughter's sleeping face and felt, for the first time in any life he could remember, something completely at rest inside him. They named her Yunha, which meant, in the old language, eternal flower. That night, later that night, when the palace was dark and the attendants had withdrawn and Ha-eun was finally, mercifully asleep, Seo-han sat by the window with his daughter held carefully against his chest and looked out at the courtyard below. The maple trees moved softly in a night wind. A single lantern had been left burning near the gate, its light reflected in the stone water basin in the garden's center, trembling slightly, persistent. He looked out at the lit courtyard and he thought of jade towers and an endless sea and a woman who had loved him well enough to destroy the thing she loved best in order to save it. He thought of the cost of that. He thought of the years she had grieved alone. He looked down at his daughter's sleeping face. I know, he said softly, to the night, to the memory, to the woman sleeping in the next room who could not fully remember but had loved him anyway through some instinct deeper than memory. I know what you did. I know what it cost. I know you carried it alone. The lantern flame steadied. I plus T have to carry anything alone again. Yunha made a small sound in her sleep. something between a sigh and a contented murmur. Seohan smiled. And outside the palace walls, beyond the maple trees and the stone lantern and the long corridors of ceremony and history and politics and memory, the autumn wind moved through the capital of the Joseon kingdom, over rooftops and through gardens and across the river that ran like a silver thread through the heart of the city, carrying with it the first cold breath of a season changing. Everything ending, everything beginning, the way it always does. Epilogue. The question remaining. But here is the thing about eternity. It doesn't stop. In the palace of the Joseon dynasty, Crown Princess Haun sometimes woke in the night with the sensation of having dreamed something vast. Not quite a nightmare, not quite a memory. Images she could not hold onto, towers made of white jade, a sea that seemed to last forever, a night full of golden lanterns, a knife in her hand, a man's face, a face she knew. She would lie in the dark and reach for the waking, and by morning the images had always dissolved. She stopped trying to hold them, but sometimes, sitting in the library with a scroll she had already read 3 times, or walking through the plum garden in early spring, or watching her daughter discover the specific joy of chasing a ribbon through palace halls, she would feel it. The sense of something vast and old that she was on the edge of understanding. The sense that she had been here before, that she had made promises, that she had kept them. One evening, about a year after their daughter's birth, she found Seohan reading alone in the outer study. She sat beside him without asking, the way she always did now, and he put his arm around her without looking up from his book, the way he always did now, and they stayed like that for a while in the comfortable silence of people who have learned each other's silences. Then, Haun, do you believe in past lives? She considered the question. Outside the study window, the evening star was rising above the palace walls, the first light in a darkening sky, steady and very bright. I believe, she said slowly, that some things are true whether you remember them or not. He set his book down. He looked at her. She was looking at the star. Ask me something else, she said. What? Whatever it is you actually want to ask me. A pause. If you had known, he said carefully, what it would cost, would you have done it anyway? She turned from the window and looked at him, those ancient, serious eyes. For a moment, just a moment, no longer than a caught breath, something moved through her gaze. Not a full memory, not the flood of another life, just the shadow of something that had once been known and was not fully forgotten. Then it was gone. She reached up and touched his face with one hand, very gently, the way someone touches something they almost lost and finally found. Yes, she said simply. Without question? Without question. He covered her hand with his. The star outside the window burned steadily in the darkening sky. And somewhere deep in the foundations of the palace, beneath the stone floors and the layered centuries and the careful structures of dynasty and tradition and law, something that had been waiting a very long time finally, quietly rested. The vow was kept. The curse was broken. The family was whole. End of the eternal vow. But in another palace, in another kingdom, in a time not yet arrived, a girl with wide, serious eyes opens a book she has never read before, and feels certain, without knowing why, that she has read it before. Season 2. The Daughter's Vow, coming soon. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Did you think she betrayed him? Or did you know all along? Subscribe, like, and comment.